All right, welcome back everybody, Ruben here, and I know I've been saying I've been wanting to get back to making some cutting boards and some patterns and stuff like that. It's been a while, but I'm gonna fix that today, or actually over the next few days as I get this video done and these boards done. So one of the things I've been wanting to do for a while since I bought this house, probably 8 or 9 months now, as I've been getting the shop set up, is this tile backsplash here in the kitchen. Every day I come out here and make my coffee multiple times because I'm an addict. I see this backsplash here, and it's a weave pattern, which has, I'll give you a close-up right here of what it looks like, has other pieces in here to kind of simulate a spaced or a loose weave pattern, not a very close or tight weave pattern. So we're gonna make cutting boards like that. I've seen a few others done on the internet before, but not quite like I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna show you the easiest and actually the best fitting way without cutting like tons of individual pieces. And of course the cat's messing with me right now. So I'm gonna go out to the shop here in a moment and explain how I kind of lay this out and how we're gonna simplify this process and make it easy to do. So let's get out there and get to it. All right, so we're out here in the shop, and over the past day while I was working from home yesterday, kind of sketch up some stuff here so I can kind of get the pattern of what, see if it'll focus there, these are gonna look like to scale. So I did this on graph paper. One of these days I'll get with the times and learn how to use SketchUp or something like that. But I'm gonna come in for a close-up and explain how we're gonna capture this pattern in individual patterns, so then we can cut those panels into strips, flip them, and then assemble the actual final cutting boards with the least amount of panels possible. So we'll come in right here and check it out. So what we're looking at right here is, and I'm gonna throw a warning out there. I am doing this in metric millimeters. Why? Because it's easier for me to get to round numbers, especially when dealing with small and thin pieces, whatnot. Otherwise, you know, you're dealing with fractions, or you're dealing with hundredths, thousandths, tenths of an inch, and it's easy to get confused as far as what your measurements are. So it looks a little bigger here than it's actually gonna be. It's gonna be similar to that backsplash in there. So this is just to scale so I could get it to round number measurements. So what I ended up with is the large sections of the weave pattern are gonna be 48 millimeters by 24 millimeters. These little squares, the dark ones in there that are gonna kind of simulate that loose weave pattern, are 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters. And then the grout lines, if you will, are gonna be 1 millimeter. So, you know, 1 millimeter is going to be tough to do, but not unless you do it in a panel. So, and actually, I'm going to correct myself there. The grout lines are 2 millimeters, so a little bit more substantial than the 1 millimeter. So 2 millimeters there. So the whole point of laying this out like this is anytime you're trying to figure out a 2D pattern and how to make long runs of strips that can then be sandwiched together to create these repeating patterns, you got to break it down by sections that repeat constantly across the whole thing. So if I take this folder right here, the first section right here, this is going to be easy. So I'm looking for the longest run this way of vertical lines with no horizontals in between. So if I come to right about yay right there, that's the first one right there. So I need to make a panel that across is this, because then those strips will get cut into the height of the cutting board, flipped on in, and then I'll have this captured pattern right here. So the next one moving up is captures part of the grout line. So I need strips that capture that pattern right there. I'm not sure if you could see it on camera right there, but in between those two right there. So a long, thin, and then thick. So how I'm gonna do that is make thick panels and then resaw them into thin strips and drum sand them down to this thickness to capture that. The next one up, so that's 2 right there panels that I need to make. Next one up, go up one more. So this one, we've got vertical lines all the way across. This is gonna be the biggest one because it captures the bulk of the actual big weave parts right here. So we've got you know, thick, thin, thicker, thin, thicker, going across, and it just repeats. Now the problem is so that's the third one that I need to make. I come up to the next one, oh, I've got another one. Because remember, we need to do one full cycle of until the pattern repeats. The last one is another grout line that's offset from this one down here that we are gonna make already. So to do that, since this pattern repeats and is square all the way around, if you take one repeating segment, if I start in the middle of any of these sections right here of the big things and start it in the middle of theirs, when it ends, it's gonna end in the middle of another one. So an alternate one. So if I start in the middle of a tall one here, the end of the panel I'm gonna make is gonna end in the middle of a short one here. So what happens is when I make that, the other thin strip right here, all I have to do then is flip that over and I've got the alternate one that goes across right there. So that saves me, instead of having to make 4 panels, I can get away with making 3 panels. And I know that it's kind of difficult to visualize right now, but I'll explain it when I get to that, what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna get some lumber down off the shelves, and I'm gonna go ahead and plane some of them down so I can start cutting some of these pieces, start with the big ones, and then we'll work from there, and I'll explain as we go. All right, so I got most of my boards planed down to the rough thicknesses of what they're gonna be cut. These two right here, this 8/4 maple, which is gonna make most of the big sections, the actual parts of the weave, I've already planed down to right within about 2/100ths of an inch of the 48mm thickness that the widest pieces are gonna be. So I'm gonna square off the edges of these, and I'm gonna cut some strips slightly, probably around 27mm, because when they're arranged in their pattern, remember that thickness of that strip is 24mm. So I'm leaving a few millimeters because once I assemble that panel, I need a millimeter or two to be able to plane down after the panel's glued up. So I'm gonna get these cut up, and we're gonna start planing out, or actually mocking up that first panel, the biggest one, then we'll work down to the smaller ones. So I got most of the parts done up for the first panel that I'm doing, which captures the first row of vertical lines. So we've got the long horizontal weave sections along with part of the vertical ones. So the adjacent rows, will finish those out. Now I can't glue this up yet because the cherry strips right here, which I'm using as the grout lines, and the shorter or narrower hard maple strips right here, which will be the long vertical ones, those I need to run through the drum sander to get them to the correct down to 2mm, and then brain fart, and 24mm. So, but I'm not gonna do that quite yet until I cut up the pieces for the next panel, because those are the two panels that have the bulk of the strips throughout them. The other ones are long runs. And the reason for that is because I wanna drum sand all those pieces at the same time, so they're all the exact same thickness to each other. That'll prevent, as the rows stack, that'll prevent shifting of the pattern, and it'll make the lines kind of line up a little bit better. I kind of stopped filming while I was cutting a bit ago because I ran into an issue with a table saw. Come to find out, things were cutting kind of wonky, and the actual trunnion, which aligns the blade to the table, the miter slots, the fence, all that stuff, was way out for some reason. I don't know if transporting it kind of messed it up or anything, but it's been a while since that. I guess I wasn't cutting anything precision, and it really showed in this. Plus my fence was out of alignment, so I had to kind of do some maintenance on the table saw and get that stuff fixed up. So I'm gonna start cutting the pieces for the second panel, and then we're gonna run all those strips through the drum sander to get them to correct dimensions, and we'll glue up those panels. So it's the next day on this project. Actually last night I realized I kind of jumped the gun on a few things. I needed to cut some more parts, and I didn't film any of that. So last night I called it a wrap because I don't know, I would just, you know, the gears weren't turning right, and sometimes I learned, I've learned that sometimes it's better to just step away from a project and, you know, resume the following morning. So I did that, and the reason why I had to take a step back is there were some other components for some of the other panels that I needed to go ahead and cut, because I need to, especially when you're talking about panels that are being made for the pattern moving across horizontally, then all of those pieces of like measurements need to be planed or drum sanded at the same time to ensure that all those pieces across the different panels are the exact same measurements. So if you get off a little bit and don't do it at the same time, it might be a 1/10 or even a 20th of a millimeter. But if you do 5, 10, or 20 of those out, that pattern will start to grow or shrink as it moves out from center. And the issue that causes when the pieces are laminated together, then the piece adjacent to it, the strip, they're not going to line up as it moves further out from the edges. So all those pieces need to be sanded or planed down at the same time. So over here I've got one of the panels. These are actually, I was able to plane these. So this is going to get glued up into the panel, and then it's going to get cut into strips the height of the board, and then it's going to get resawn into thin strips, because this is going to create one of the thin strips, the captures part of the horizontal grout line, if you will. All of these pieces over here, so this stack right here of these components have to get sanded down to 24 millimeters. These are good to go right here. They're already to size here. These thin strips down to 2 millimeters, and then over a little bit further here, these walnut strips, which will be the dark little squares in between all the weaves, down to 10 millimeters. So now we're gonna move finally over to the drum sander and start getting these sanded down. Then we can start gluing up panels. So we got all our initial strips cut up and arranged into the panels that they're going to be glued up in. So we're going to get all these panels glued up, and then once that's done, they'll get planed down to, this one has to go to its appropriate thickness, because this one's going to stay the same and then get cut into strips. The other panels are going to get resawn into thinner strips, and then of course sanded down to make the really thin strips. So I'm going to go ahead and get this one glued up. This one has big, the really thin strips, the medium ones, big, and it just repeats. And this is going to be part of the bulk of the weave pattern, and you'll see as we get closer to do that. So I'm gonna separate all these pieces so I can get glue on them all real quick and get them glued up. Okay, so apparently I got cut off there because my memory card in the camera was full and I didn't see it while I was doing it. Plus I couldn't stop because I needed to get this one assembled because the glue was starting to set up, and it's always a bad thing when it starts to tack up. So really all I did is I used my bars in my clamp video. I used these to flatten out the panels, because you'll get a tendency for them to kind of want to squeeze out of place or twist or raise up from one another. Those help flatten them so you can get a lot closer to tolerances with cutting your pieces. And I don't have to plane off but maybe 1 millimeter or 2 total thickness to get them perfectly flat again. I'm gonna let this one set up. I'm gonna grab a wet rag real quick, wipe off all the excess glue, clean up glue off stuff, the roller, all that stuff, and then get set up for starting to glue up the other panels, and we'll try to get this going and see what we end up with. Good morning. So we're back for another day on this weave cutting board project, and I've got my 3 panels here after they were glued up. I do like to, on some of these, kind of run, I have a scraper I run to get some of the high spots of glue if I didn't manage to wipe everything off of one side, because that side's going to be on the bed of the planer as I run them through, and it creates a nice even surface. Otherwise you get a lot of weird things happening when it goes through the planer. So I don't know, in that first part of the glue up for these panels, if you caught, I kind of botched, and this, I broke one of my rules after I do a glue up, a clamp up of these panels. Always check, verify the pattern before you let them dry. So I think this top panel right here, I was on this end over here, this end strip right here, this little cherry strip in the middle was missing. So I had 2 of these maple strips adjacent to one another, and I didn't realize that till the next morning. But I always, when I cut up the pieces for these panels, I always cut 1 or 2 extra strips, just in case. So I was able to just on the table saw cut off that one piece right next to the glue line, right up alongside it, and get that nice and going right there, then re-add the strip and then clamp back on the end strip right there. So crisis averted right there, and it was on the very end, so it's not gonna mess with the pattern. This top panel right here, I have to plane down to 24 millimeters. It's gonna be close because the strips I cut a little close to that. So if I go slightly under, it's not a concern on this panel right here, and I'll explain that later, because that break will happen this way and it won't affect the pattern. The other 2 panels are just getting planed down till they're flat on both sides, because those are gonna get re-sawn into other strips to finish out the pattern. So let's jump over to the planer and get this going, and we'll start cutting stuff up. So we got everything planed down. I did some math to figure out how thick I want to make these cuts to yield the size of board I want. I think I'm just going to do 1 large board out of this set. I'm going to have a bunch of pieces of the other ones left over, but this main section for the bulk of the weave pattern, I'm running really low on hard maple, so I'll just save all the parts from all the other panels that we're going to cut into strips until later, until I get more maple, and then I'll make another one of these panels to make more boards. So I'm going to square off the ends of these, and I'm going to do right at just under 2 inch thick, so pretty close to 2 inch, because this is going to be a long board, and we're going to cut all these into strips and go from there. those panels cut down. Remember, they were like this, long panels. We cut them into the thickness of just over what we want the final board to be. So right now they're at just shy of 2 inches. So they're going to be pretty solid boards. So now the one panel is fine how it is as far as cut into strips, because that was already accounted for the thickness of those pieces. Now, so this piece right here that captures the little dark squares, which is the walnut, that's going to have those little squares that fills in the void where the kind of gaps, if you will, for the loose weave pattern. We now need to resaw these strips in grain up to just over that 10 millimeters, so we have that square in the repeating pattern through. So I'm going to go probably closer to 11 millimeters here on the bandsaw, because we'll run them through the drum sander to get them down to the final 10 millimeters again. And the other panel is down to 2 millimeters because it captures the long sections across the grout lines. And once again, those will be drum sanded as well. I'm doing this on the bandsaw because the resaw blade I have on here is considerably thinner. It's like maybe a third the width of the table saw blade. So I can get a better yield, even though I have to sand them afterwards to get them down to the final thickness. I get a better yield out of each one of these. So usually out of a strip like this, I might get an extra 1 or 2 strips out of it. So it's much more efficient. So I'm gonna get to work on these, and then we'll see what they turn out looking like. All right, so welcome back. As you can probably guess from the title of the video, I ran into a problem with this project, and just to frame it for you. So yesterday, as I was cutting all the panels into strips and everything, and I did the initial kind of fit up to see how stuff aligned, and just right now it's just after midnight at night. I just got off work. I'm working 12-hour shifts right now. But I wanted to kind of wrap up this video a little bit to figure out where to go from here to see if this project's gonna be salvageable, recoverable. One way or another, I'm still gonna make boards, but this pattern. So long story short, what happened is somehow in the process, and how I mentioned before is it's important like parts to be all planed or drum sanded at the same time. That's to ensure that all of the dimensions stay exactly the same, because as you can see in this piece right here, so you know, from that distance, I'll do a close up here in a second. This has a bunch of the walnut strips in it, but each one of those walnut strips is surrounded by the 2 millimeter cherry strips for that part of the pattern. Well, the issue I found out trying to figure out what happened is I did a test fit up right here. And obviously I didn't math very well because I got a little bit of an offset to be able to alternate the pattern and flipping them. They're off a little bit, which is a non-issue. The ends would just get cut square anyways. The big issue is somehow, so 2 panels that were cut into strips to make this pattern have those 2 millimeter vertical strips of cherry running through them to simulate the vertical grout lines, looking at it this way. The third strip does not have it. So it was this strip right here that was then cut down to and then sanded down, while these they're not actually sanded because I stopped and I realized there was an issue, would be 2 millimeters. And these replicate the horizontal grout lines along with the sections that pass through the actual vertical weave pattern. So what happened is when I aligned it here, and I'll do a close-up right here so you can kind of see as I'm explaining this, if I align the pattern to the middle, right here, how everything's aligned right here, and everything's lining up good, and mind you, once this was oiled, all of the cherry strips would kind of golden up a little bit, so the grout lines would be more noticeable and create a lot more separation between there and the vertical and horizontal maple strips, which would be considerably lighter in comparison. So the issue is, come to find out, all of those vertical strips in there that should be 2 millimeters actually ended up, when I took the average of measurements of everything, is most of them are averaging in between 2.05 and 2.1 millimeters. Now that caused an issue because, not thinking about it, is there's a whole bunch of them in this strip that captures the walnut sections. There's about half as many in the other section, and in the third section there's none of those strips. So the problem is that extra 0.05 to 0.1 millimeters starts adding all the way across. So as you can kind of see in this what I have clamped up right here, this section of the pattern, they're lined up in the middle, but as you progress out from the middle, that in these thin strips, that difference in measurements become apparent, because these pieces that capture those horizontal, vertical cherry strips start to grow a little bit and start to offset the pattern. So as you get out to the edges, it doesn't line up anymore. It kind of does, but it's way too far off to be considered acceptable. You're never gonna get a perfect fitting because wood swells, it shrinks. When you compress it, clamp it together, glue, just moisture from the glue will cause swelling. So you're gonna get a little bit of offset. The goal is to have as little offset or difference there as possible, as to not break the pattern to the eye without getting right up on it. So I have to figure out if I just wanna, because this big one that I'm gonna make, I'm gonna keep for myself, as I always wanted a big chopping block, and I've never made myself a nice cutting board, which is kind of sad considering how, hundreds I've made. So what I'm actually thinking of doing is, it's a tough decision right now because I have a government job, so I'm under travel restrictions. I can only go so far out of the area without having to quarantine after I come back because of COVID. So if I can find within a reasonable distance another supply of hard maple, because I'm low, I've got tons of cherry and walnut, stuff like that, then I might make another full panel and start over that strip and account for that extra fraction of a millimeter all the way across in the third strip, which is easy enough to do. It's a very uncomplicated strip to do because it's just alternating the 24 millimeter size of the actual weave pattern in maple, and then the, I want to say it's 52 millimeters, because 48 width of those strips plus the 2 millimeter grout lines, how it needs to, so 52 millimeters. And then just on each one of those add a fraction and actually cut all those, mock it up without gluing it, and just slowly drum sand those down until I get an acceptable difference there that's not quite as far off as this one. So no way, shape, or form would I be satisfied really with, I could put this together and do up the board and cut off part of the ends so it's not too noticeable on edge, but it's still gonna bother me. It's something I would never sell, that's for sure. Even if I could keep it for myself and just roll with it, it would really bother me every time I looked at it. So I don't think I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna take a look around while I'm working the next couple days, see if I can scrounge up enough maple to make another small panel to at least finish one board with the new dimensions of those strips, and see if I can make that work. Worst case scenario, I might have to wait a week or two. So I'm gonna wrap up this video now. As far as this progress in this project goes, because it might be a considerable amount of time before I'll be able to kind of remedy this situation, if it's even possible. So it was kind of soul crushing yesterday when that happened, and once again, it's my fault. I should have glued up one strip that had that pattern in it, or one panel, and then taken, after I'd sanded down all the other strips for all of the adjacent pieces, and then done a dry kind of test fit mock-up, clamp all those together in the pattern to make sure I got an acceptable alignment, because you're always gonna get a little bit of that kind of grows over time, even, I'm talking hundredths of an inch. So it is what it is. It's definitely a learning lesson and something to be mindful about, how complex these processes can be sometimes. And it doesn't always work out due to, you know, a fraction of a millimeter. You're talking 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch tolerances sometimes, and that's really tough to achieve in wood. So kind of, I'll make sure I kind of figure something out soon over the next few days, and hopefully by this next week I'll have a new video out figuring out what my decision is as far as resolving this. But until then, thanks for kind of hanging with me, and I'll see you next time.